We're going to read 2 Corinthians 10 in just a second. So if you want to locate that, we'll just read through the whole chapter and then we'll come back and talk about some things. How many of us have seen the play Texas out in Palo Duro Canyon? The amazing thing is, it is, well, you obviously go down into the canyon, and at the amphitheater there, they have a barbecue dinner before and on and on. But if you know to look at an appropriate time, they literally have a horse that starts working his way up the canyon wall. And as it becomes dark, then this rider comes riding across the rim of the canyon with this Texas flag and a spotlight on it. And the whole play of Texas is given within the context, literally, of the Palo Duro Canyon. At a point in time, obviously it's artificial, but it looks like even lightning bounces off of the wall. And so the setting in which the play is conducted contributes an awful lot to just the play compared to being in a building or something. So what I want to do today is that obviously we're going to read 2 Corinthians 10, and the tone of the whole book of 2 Corinthians is going to totally change. And we have noticed, I've called them Judaizers. After Paul has left, people have come in and are wanting to say, the gospel is good, but then you need to add, and you start filling in the blank, either circumcision or food laws, the things from the law of Moses. And in order to have their influence on the church, they have spent a lot of time criticizing and making light of Paul as an apostle. And I think what's helpful for us is that 2,000 years later, because of the influence of his writings, we see Paul in primarily a very positive, a very wholesome, a very appreciative light, but especially in the church in Corinth, and it's not the only place, there are an element of people, and I'm going to actually use this word, who are embarrassed when Paul is preaching. And so what we'd like to do today is to kind of look at that backdrop of the things that are going on. And like I said, the tone, once you come to chapter 10, through the rest of the letter, Paul is going to, and it's not very subtle, it's very direct, just again and again, he is going to point out things that his critics have said, and in his own way, he is going to respond to the criticisms that are there. So there are several things in chapter 10 we won't get to today, and Lord willing, we'll come back and combine some of those with chapter 11. But we're starting in 2 Corinthians 10. By the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. And if you've been in an earlier class, when Paul uses this term parkaleo, it's an appeal. It's this is what I want you to do. This is a wrap your arm around someone. This is my term in terms of schooling. This is the behavioral objective. This is when you get through reading this letter, this is what I want you to do. But notice, and again, I don't think that Paul is just defensive totally, but there is a sense in which he is. The only churches that Paul says imitate me are churches that he started. Paul is going to use a reference, I am your father in the gospel. So how do you feel when you have left and someone is coming in and is leading your spiritual children astray? There's more than just kind of a casual investment in the Corinthian church. And the criticisms of Paul, as we're going to see, is that he's timid and weak. And we'll come to that here in just a second. But he's going to start with that right off the bat. And if you know what the critics are saying, just not every other verse, but just constantly, Paul is going to be addressing the criticisms that have been made. So I, Paul, who am timid, my newer translation has in quotation marks, when face to face, but bold when away. And then here comes the term again, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of the world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. 10:4. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have a divine power to tear down strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And I love this last part of the verse. We take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. You are looking only at the surface of things. If anyone is confident that he belongs to Christ, he should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as he is. Verse 8. For even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than pulling you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you for my letters, and we're going to come back to this verse for much of our lesson. For some say, and here he's addressing very specific his critics. And again, what to me is significant about this is that this is not how we see Paul 2,000 years later because of the heritage, the wonderful nature of the letters. But notice how some people see Paul in the flesh in his day. His letters are weighty and forceful, but in person, he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. Verse 12. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. For when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the field that God has assigned to us, a field that reaches even to you. We are not going too far in our boasting, as it would be the case if we had not come to you, for we did not get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of the work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our area of activity among you will be greatly expanded, so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For I do not want to boast about work already done in another man's territory, but let him who boasts boast in the Lord. For it is not the man who commends himself who is approved, but the man whom the Lord commends. If you have the outline, we're going to start on the back page, and then we'll come back to the front. So if you'll turn to the back. I've mentioned this previously. We had worked with a church that David and Coy Roper had begun in North Ryde, and they had been there 10 years. There was a little bit of gap, and we were there 4. And then we left to start a brand new congregation. And after we left, a couple came in, and it became very apparent that the only reason they had come was literally just to take over the whole church. And just very, very subtly, but very specifically, they started cultivating people on their side They started dividing people. They started trying to pull people into their point of view. And the workers who had been there, 15 or 20 years, it was an all-out assault on the Australian workers who were there. And it became very apparent that their only reason for being there was to have a coup and to literally take over the church and the property. Our school was there, so I was there 3 days a week. So that's how I was involved in this, because there'd be people leaving and crying and on, and they were just fomenting things all the time. And for example, and I'm just going to call this guy Joe, they would come to Joe, who, may I use the term a spiritual midget, and not trying to be derogatory, but someone who wasn't really mature, and they would come along and just say, "Aren't you glad that someone has come along that realizes what a spiritual giant you are? You would really make a fine elder in the church someday." And they would just go to these people all the time. Then they'd come to this person and say, "Well, I'm having trouble working with brother so-and-so. Can you give me some help on some ways that I can do this?" And we had 5 meetings that lasted between 4 to 5 hours. We didn't have carpet, we had tile floor. There were literally pools of tears at people's feet during these meetings. We did this 5 times, and within 24 or 36 hours, she undid everything that we did in 5 hours. And so, do you remember when David fled from Jerusalem? Absalom comes in, and they're just having to literally run for their lives. How sober is it when the Australian preacher calls and says, "If you have anything in this building, books or possessions that you want, you need to take out, because there's going to be a vote tonight and we may lose the building." If the other side gets their way, they have already contacted a locksmith, and they will change the locks on the door, Greg, and lock us out. Thankfully, the final vote was 17 to 13. They were within 4 votes of taking over the whole building. A church that was 100 and 110 on a good day, by the time these people left, was 25. So I want you just to stop and think. Can you imagine, from one year to the next, you've been coming to church and worshiping with 100 and 110 people, and then a year later, there's 25 of you. And the spiritual carnage that took place was just staggering. I went at least to 3 people's houses and knocked on the door, and a couple of times I could tell they were in the house, and they were just so hurt that they wouldn't even come to the door, Bill, so we could even talk. When you experience something like that, and then you read what's going on in 2 Corinthians, that's why I use this term infiltration. And this is my wonder. I just think about this. And you've heard me mention this, you've been in classes. I think the one person who was the most surprised on the first day of the week when Jesus rose from the dead was Satan. Luke and John both say that Satan entered Judas in order to prompt Judas to do the things that he did. If Satan had any idea that Jesus was going to be raised on the first day of the week for his ultimate defeat, would he ever have entered Judas to betray Jesus? And his fury, and you think in the book of Revelation with the dragon and the woman, his fury is that every time he can, he is going to cause trouble. He's going to have difficulty for the church and for the disciples. And he has no morals, he has no ethics. And the group of people who have come in have spent a lot of their time cultivating the spiritually immature. They have spent a lot of time dividing, and their primary anthem the whole time they have been there are criticisms about Paul. If you remember the play Texas, here's kind of the canyon wall of the book of 2 Corinthians. And we'll do this very quickly and get to some other things on the front page. There was something through the first century called the Second Sophisticate, and all that this is there were people in the first century especially, and koine, the common Greek, was the Greek that was normally spoken, and that had been there since the time of Alexander for close to 300 years. But people decided, we're not going to speak the koine Greek, we're going to go back and speak the 400-year-old Greek of classical Athens, oftentimes called Attic. And so the people who were educated, rather than speaking in the common koine language that was kind of the trade language, the commercial language, then the people who were, quote, especially educated, then they went back 400 years and they just virtually exclusively spoke in a dialect that was 400 years old. And this very clearly made an us and them characteristic. So if you look at that first paragraph, they look back to the classical traditions, and the movement was noted for its rhetoric and its performance in public speaking. And so those who were speaking, who had been trained in this, were very distinctive. They were very different from the people in the Koine language. During the Roman peace, second paragraph, oftentimes called the Pax Romana, then once the Romans had conquered the world, even one of the Roman poets said, culturally, the Greeks conquered the Romans. And when you read through this, what's going to happen is that a lot of the very well-to-do and established Roman families would send their sons to Athens for university. And as these young men grew up and became a prominent part of the Roman Empire, their studies and they're Romans, but their studies in Greek culture became such an important part of their lives, and so much of the business, so much of the trade and commerce is going to actually be done in Greek. And there's a dark print. Horace said, conquered Greece, took captive her savage conqueror, and brought her the arts of rustic Latinum. And so what's going to take place, and you'll see this next paragraph, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, this is not very far from the Isle of Patmos, and here's a young man who's Greek, who has brought into this, and he goes to Rome and writes a history of ancient Rome. So he goes all the way back to the earliest traditions. However, it is written in 400-year-old Greek. And so what is going to develop is that if you have something important to say, how you say it is more important than what you say. Now let me just stop for a second. And I know a number of people listen to this who aren't here. There are some churches today that will not allow you to speak unless you read out of a 400-year-old translation. We had worked with, there were actually two young ladies that became Christians. One was married, the other was single when we were at Eastside. And 6 months later, the young married Christian came in, and she was really frustrated. She said, "It is not working." And I said, "I need some help. What is not working?" And she says, "I've been reading my Bible, and my Bible says my husband will be won over by my conversation. And I have just been talking his ear off, and the more I talk, the less responsive he gets. I just can't understand. It is not working, and I'm doing what my Bible says." And how do you say this? I said, "Sweetheart, I so appreciate you reading your Bible. However, 400 years ago, conversation meant conduct. Conversation meant behavior. Conversation meant actions. May I politely say conversation means that you shut here and you do this." And she said, "Oh, I've been doing everything wrong, haven't I?" Well, 400 years ago, that's what the word conversation meant. But if someone today reads that and is not able to go back and translate something 400 years old, they get totally the wrong meaning. The other thing I think is so ironic, and again, there are churches, unless you read from the King James Bible, you can't teach or preach. Our dear friend Charlie Powell, who's recently passed away, every year would virtually read completely through his Greek New Testament. And so most of his lessons he actually just translated from his Greek New Testament. When we were in Australia, we would teach Ephesians, and here would be Charlie's Greek New Testament, and I'd have some historical notes, and we'd stand there, and he was just superb at translating that. He can't teach in a congregation where you have to have a 400-year-old translation. Isn't that terrible? He reads from his Greek New Testament, so he can't preach in a church like that. And so what is going on in the first century is that someone who is eloquent, someone who is saying the right thing in the right way, is able to use a language that is 400 years old. Paul is not going to participate in that. I think he has the capacity to do that, but Paul is going to speak in the koine, in the common Greek, and this still is interesting. The Greek influence was so strong that when he writes the letter to the church in Rome, it's not in Latin, it's in Greek. But because Paul will only speak in the common language of the common man, there were a lot of people in Corinth who became very critical of him because of that. So if you turn back to the very first page, we're going to read a section from 1 Corinthians, and when you hear words like wisdom, when you hear words like eloquent, when you hear words like learned, because Corinth is in Greece, the Corinthians would be very influenced by, and these are the early beginnings of this second sophisticate, and there are going to be people in the church in Corinth that because Paul will only speak in the language of the common man, are literally embarrassed when Paul speaks in public. But let's notice this. We're in 1 Corinthians, and this discussion runs through the Corinthians, but we're in 1 Corinthians 1:18. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And notice these words, wisdom. It is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. 1:20. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? And all of these are terms that are associated with Greek philosophy and Greek learning. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and here it is, Greeks seek wisdom. What happened when Paul preached in Athens? A few people listened, but the majority of the people did what? They scoffed and they laughed at him. And the Greeks are seeking wisdom, but we preached Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and here it is, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. And so we're going to come back to this. We're going to touch on something with Paul's personal suffering and his struggles. But here's the chasm, here's the divide, here's the point of contention. The people who are either more educated or are part of this movement of the second sophisticate in Corinth, or just the critics who come in and they're doing everything they can to influence people and pull people away from Paul. And that's why I entitled today, Paul and His Corinthian Critics. We touched on this previous, and this will take us into the next chapter, but I want us just to stop and let this sink in for a second. Remember all the way back in Acts 9? God told Ananias, "You go to Paul, and I will show him how much he must suffer in my name." And this is actually the third of these in the book of 2 Corinthians, and they're in different ways. This is the most specifically in terms of just the human body. But think about this. There are days where Paul is a day laborer working with his hands, probably as much a leather worker as a tent maker. It would be hard to carry all the materials to make tents, but these guys were leather workers, and he could work with his hands. The Cranes especially will know Mary's Market on 23rd Street, and every Saturday. Bill, how would you describe Mary's Market?
Large collection of junk.
A large collection of junk. And there's just a little bit of everything at Mary's Market. Swap meet, you can get your knives sharpened, just virtually everything. Well, if you are a worker with your hands, you can do everything from belts to shoes and work with and find places like that. So there are going to be times where Paul is going to spend all of his time, can I say day laborer, and communicate what I'm trying to say? 2 Corinthians is also written before the journey to Rome and the shipwreck that we have on the way there. So when we read about the things that have taken place, 2 Corinthians is before all the events that we have in the book of Acts. And I asked this earlier to anticipate this today. What would Paul's physical body look like after these traumatic experiences? So we're in 2 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 23. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings. I mean, with each of these, just let this sink in. What does someone look like physically who's just been beaten over and over again, often near death? And then here's some specifics. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. Do you understand what I'm trying to do? Just stop and think. What does a human body look like that 5 times, and I'm sure this is blood and scars and everything else, 5 times he's been beaten, 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, and he doesn't mention this, and drug out the city and outside the city and left for dead. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A day and a night I was adrift at sea. And then here's the dangers: journeys, rivers, robbers, my own people, the Gentiles. I was in danger in the city, in the wilderness, at sea. I was in danger from false brothers. Toil and hardship through many sleepless nights. In hunger and thirst, often without food. In cold and exposure. And apart from all these things, there's the daily anxiety of the churches. So when Paul's critics say he is weak, there's a reason why he's weak. It's amazing that he's still able to function. And my expression for Paul, particularly at this time, is that he's a walking scar. He has just been beaten and whipped and stoned and all of these other things. But here's the contrast I want you to see from someone we're familiar with. When Apollos is at Corinth, Apollos is from Alexandria. When I was at Macquarie University, most of our teachers had gone to Cambridge, and they could do the Oxford accent in ridicule. But one of my teachers said, in the ancient world, Athens was the Oxford, but Alexandria was the Cambridge of the ancient world. At one time, the library in Alexandria had 700,000 scrolls in it. There were entire we're not talking about books, we're talking about scrolls. And just imagine how many buildings that you would have to have in different places to house a library of 700,000 scrolls. Virtually all of the material that we have from antiquity has come to us through Alexandria. Because that's where Apollos is from, notice the descriptions. He is an eloquent man. Do you see what we're saying? Because of his background and his education and his training, when Apollos preaches, there are people in Corinth that say, wasn't that wonderful? How he said it, in their mind, complicated what he said. He is also competent and powerful in the scriptures. Here's Paul, he's from Tarsus. But Tarsus is also the university town for Asia Minor, for the eastern part of Turkey. But when Paul is here, his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. So when you turn the page, do you remember when God calls Moses, the first thing Moses says is, I'm not eloquent, I can't speak. God says, well, bring your brother. Jesus is described as someone, well, no, let's just stay with Apollos. Apollos is an eloquent man. So two things come to mind, and I'll leave you to read most of this. Eloquent can also mean learned and cultured, but eloquent can also have to do with expression. And here's what's very interesting. Paul will allow Apollos to be who he is without criticizing him. Paul's critics won't do that. And this is where this divide comes, and earlier when some will say, oh, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. And thankfully, a few people in Corinth said, I'm of Christ, which is such an irony. But you can see why some people are so drawn to Apollos because of his background and his ability. When you look at, and I'm about 3/4 the way down the page, with eloquent being someone who's competent and capable, they're going to say about Paul, his letters are weighty and strong. And if you look at the very bottom, important, fierce, mighty. He writes a really strong letter, but his bodily presence is weak. So let's turn the page. When I read this catalog of suffering, and then I listen to Paul's critics in Rome, there's probably some good physical reasons why what they're saying is accurate. I just can't imagine what a person's physical body would look like going through all of those things. I mean, I don't know. Do we have arthritis? Do we have vision problems? And some have wondered, because in about 4 or 5 of his letters, it's very clear he is dictating the letter and someone else is writing it down. He may even have blurred vision by this time. And so this is an area where his critics can say, and let's just do the comparison, here's Apollos. He's eloquent, he's well-spoken. When Apollos gives a lesson, these people are just have this really warm feeling, this was great. And at the same time, they have exactly the opposite feeling when Paul gives a lesson. And those who want to be his critics then are pointing out things that are probably legitimate and true in some different ways. But look at this word weak. It has to do with someone who is powerless, possibly sick, ill, or maybe feeble. Sometimes the word means to suffer from a debilitating illness. And this is the underline at the top, to experience some incapacity or limitations because one is weak. Do you remember Jesus saying, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? The wife is referred to as the weaker vessel. We're not going to have any arm wrestling contest, but in most families, the husband is physically stronger than the wife. Okay? I know there are some exceptions, but when Paul talks about the weaker vessel, he's not putting her down, but he's just saying in terms of strength. This never came to a head, but this was not true in my family. My mom's hands were about a third bigger than mine, and we were pulling cotton with cotton sacks, and my dad would quietly say, my wife can pull more pounds of cotton in a week than any man in Beckham County. She had big shoulders, and we would start on these half-mile rows, and she would just hum and sing and just carry on and sweat and just being outside and everything else. Before she died, she had a stroke. She wasn't getting enough oxygen to the brain. It took 8 firemen and policemen and ambulance people to get her out of her room into the hospital. It was like fighting a tiger. She was just so strong. But weak, a comparison compared to something that is strong. So his personal presence is unimpressive. He is physically weak. And his speech, if you'll see 1:4, is of no account. And this is a word for either to despise or something that is contemptible. And one of the translations says, it is worthless, it is no value. So right in the middle, here's these 4 translations about Paul's speech, and listen to his critics through these translations. His personal presence is unimpressive. His speech is contemptible, New American, NIV. In person, he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Muntz, a translation, his physical presence is weak. His rhetoric amounts to nothing. His actual presence is feeble, and his speaking is beneath contempt. And so Paul's critics are going to say, when he's away, it's like he carries a big stick and he writes these really strong letters. But when he comes in person, and I think probably because of all of the physical ailments and the things that he has suffered through the persecutions and things, his bodily presence is weak. And for some people, and it's hard to say, but this is how they would feel, and I can't even hardly say this, but there would be some people in Corinth that would hope we don't have any visitors when Paul is speaking. Because in that sense, they feel like he's an embarrassment. If you look at the bottom, and something happened in Galatians chapter 4, you'll read most of these. Paul says, because of a bodily ailment, I preached the gospel to you. My condition was a trial. And then, if you look toward the bottom, Galatians 4, in connection with my physical disabilities, you showed no disdain, and you did not treat me with contempt because of my physical appearance. And when you look at this word contempt, Jesus is going to mention this in Mark 9:11-12, that the Son of Man will suffer many things and be treated with contempt. And then just a couple of things on the back page. Herod and his soldiers are going to treat Jesus with contempt. And so this is a strong word. And Paul says, because of my physical ailments, because of my physical weakness, to the Galatians, you did not treat me with contempt. But here's what I want to close with. With all the things going on, this is why Paul is just such an amazing man. Paul says, I want to preach the gospel in lands beyond you. So we're in 2 Corinthians 10:16. Without boasting of work done in another man's area of influence. And for example, back in the book of Romans, Paul writes to the church in Rome and basically says, I have done all of these things in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. I want to come to Rome. I want to be with you for a while. And then what does he want to do? I want you to send me on my way to Spain. And here's one of these things that inspiration doesn't tell us if that happened or not. But isn't that amazing when Jesus talks about we're to go into the uttermost parts of the earth with all of the physical ailments and all the struggles and the problems that he has, then Paul wants to be able to preach the gospel from Jerusalem all the way to Spain. And like I said, someday we'll find out if he actually made it. But that was his ambition in what he wanted to do in serving God. God bless you this week.